October 20, 1944. Leyte Island, Philippines. A landing craft beaches on Red Beach at Palo. General Douglas MacArthur, dressed in pressed khakis with his trademark aviator sunglasses and corncob pipe, steps off the ramp into knee-deep water. Photographers capture the moment as the Supreme Commander wades ashore, flanked by Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and other officials. MacArthur reaches a microphone hastily set up on the beach and delivers the words he had promised 2.5 years earlier. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. We have come, dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives, and of restoring, upon a foundation of indestructible strength, the liberties of your people." The moment is carefully staged for maximum dramatic effect. MacArthur had actually come ashore earlier but repeated the landing for photographers, but the emotion is genuine. For MacArthur, this return represents personal vindication. In March 1942, he had been ordered to evacuate from Corregidor as Japanese forces completed their conquest of the Philippines. Before leaving, he made his famous promise, "I shall return." Many dismissed it as empty rhetoric. Now, 30 months later, he has made good on that vow. The Philippine Campaign that begins with this beach landing will last 9 months, involve hundreds of thousands of troops, and liberate an archipelago of over 7,000 islands. It will witness the largest naval battle in history at Leyte Gulf, brutal urban warfare in Manila, and desperate Japanese resistance across dozens of islands. It will cost tens of thousands of American and Filipino lives, and over 200,000 Japanese dead. But it will fulfill MacArthur's promise and begin the final liberation of Southeast Asia. This is the story of MacArthur's return, a campaign driven by strategy and ego, redemption and revenge, military necessity and personal honor. It is the story of how American and Filipino forces, fighting together, reclaimed an archipelago that had become a symbol of American defeat and transformed it into a stepping stone toward Japan itself. By mid-1944, American forces had advanced across the Pacific on 2 axes. Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive had captured the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands, bringing B-29 bombers within range of Japan. General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Campaign had advanced through New Guinea, isolating the major Japanese base at Rabaul. The question facing Allied planners was, what next? MacArthur insisted the Philippines must be liberated. His arguments were strategic, political, and personal. Strategically, he contended that the Philippines provided essential bases for the invasion of Japan, controlled sea lanes to Southeast Asia, and would cut Japanese communications with their resource-rich southern conquests. Politically, he argued that America had a moral obligation to liberate the Filipinos who had remained loyal despite brutal Japanese occupation. Personally, MacArthur was determined to keep his promise and avenge the humiliation of 1942. Admiral Ernest King and other Navy leaders advocated bypassing the Philippines entirely. They proposed advancing directly to Formosa, Taiwan, which would sever Japanese supply lines equally effectively while avoiding a costly campaign through defended islands. The Philippines, they argued, had little strategic value if American forces could operate from bases closer to Japan. The debate reached President Franklin Roosevelt, who met with MacArthur and Nimitz in Hawaii in July 1944. MacArthur made his case passionately, arguing that abandoning the Philippines would be unconscionable and politically disastrous. Americans would never forgive leaving Filipinos under Japanese occupation. The strategic arguments mattered, but MacArthur's political point resonated. Roosevelt, facing re-election in November 1944, understood the public relations disaster of bypassing the Philippines. He approved MacArthur's plan. The decision meant MacArthur would command the largest operation of his career. The invasion would employ multiple army divisions, the 7th Fleet, and massive air support. The campaign would proceed in phases. First Leyte in the central Philippines, then Mindoro to establish air bases, then Luzon, the main island containing Manila, and finally mopping up operations throughout the archipelago. Japan's leadership understood the Philippines' strategic importance. Losing the islands would sever Japan from oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies, the lifeblood of the war machine. Without Philippine bases, Japanese forces in Southeast Asia would be isolated and the home islands vulnerable to invasion. The Philippines had to be held. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya who had conquered Singapore, took command of Japanese forces in the Philippines in October 1944, ironically, just as the Americans were landing at Leyte. Yamashita inherited a difficult situation. He commanded approximately 432,000 troops, but many were poorly equipped support units, not combat formations. The 14th Area Army was spread across hundreds of islands. Communications were poor. Supply lines were vulnerable to submarine attack. Yamashita's defensive strategy was realistic rather than optimistic. He knew he could not defeat the Americans, but he could make them pay a terrible price. He would concentrate forces on Luzon, particularly in the mountain regions where terrain favored the defender. He would avoid decisive battles in favor of prolonged resistance. He would make the Americans fight for every island, every city, every mountain, delaying the inevitable invasion of Japan and buying time for the homeland to prepare defenses or negotiate peace. The Navy, however, had different ideas. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, devised Operation Shogo, Victory Operation, a desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The plan called for Japanese surface forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from multiple directions, while carrier forces acted as decoys to lure away American carriers. If successful, the operation would annihilate American amphibious forces and doom the invasion. If unsuccessful, which was more likely, the combined fleet would be destroyed. Toyoda accepted the risk. Without the Philippines, Japan was finished anyway. The invasion of Leyte began on October 20, 1944, with landings on the island's eastern coast. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's 6th Army, 4 divisions initially, eventually reinforced to 7, came ashore with minimal resistance. The beaches were secured quickly. MacArthur made his famous wadding ashore moment. By nightfall, 132,000 troops and 200,000 tons of supplies were ashore. But Japanese resistance stiffened rapidly. General Tomochika Yamashita, no relation to Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanded the 35th Army defending Leyte with approximately 20,000 troops, later reinforced to 60,000. The Japanese fought fiercely, utilizing the mountainous terrain and heavy rainfall that turned roads into quagmires. American advances slowed to yards per day in some sectors. On October 23-26, the Battle of Leyte Gulf unfolded, the largest naval battle in history. Japanese forces nearly succeeded in reaching the vulnerable American transports, but Admiral William Halsey's controversial decision to chase Japanese carriers northward, combined with heroic resistance by American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar, saved the invasion force. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers. American losses were much lighter. The combined fleet as an offensive force ceased to exist. With Japanese naval power destroyed, the Americans controlled the sea approaches, but the ground campaign bogged down. The Battle of Leyte lasted not the few weeks originally planned, but nearly 3 months. American forces had to fight through mountains, jungles, and monsoon rains against determined Japanese defenders. The 1st Cavalry Division fought brutal battles at Karagara. The 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions struggled through Leyte Valley. The 77th Infantry Division conducted an amphibious assault at Ormoc Bay to outflank Japanese positions. The Japanese employed kamikaze attacks with increasing frequency. Suicide aircraft damaged dozens of American ships. The escort carrier sent low was sunk. Other vessels suffered severe damage. The psychological impact of kamikazes was profound. Sailors faced an enemy willing to die for certain while attempting to kill them. By Christmas 1944, Leyte was secure, but at significant cost. American casualties totaled approximately 15,500, 3,500 killed. Japanese losses exceeded 50,000 dead. The island's infrastructure was devastated. The monsoon rains had turned Leyte into a muddy nightmare, but MacArthur had his foothold in the Philippines, and the next phase could begin. While fighting continued on Leyte, MacArthur prepared for the invasion of Luzon, the main Philippine island. First, airfields were needed closer to Manila. Mindoro Island, lying between Leyte and Luzon, became the target. On December 15, 1944, the Western Visayan Task Force landed on Mindoro against light opposition. Engineers immediately began constructing airfields. Japanese kamikaze attacks sank 2 LSDs and damaged several other vessels, but the operation succeeded. By January 1945, P-38 fighters and A-20 bombers were operating from Mindoro airfields, providing air cover for the upcoming Luzon invasion. The Luzon invasion, Operation MacArthur, would be MacArthur's largest and most complex operation. The 6th Army, reinforced to 14 divisions, would assault Leyte Gulf on Luzon's western coast, the same beaches where the Japanese had landed in December 1941. Simultaneously, smaller operations would strike southern Luzon to prevent Japanese forces from reinforcing the main battle area. General Yamashita commanded approximately 287,000 troops on Luzon, organized into 3 groups. The Shabu Group, 152,000 men, defended northern Luzon. The Kembu Group, 30,000 men, held the Clark Field area. The Shimbu Group, 80,000 men, defended Manila and the mountains east of the city. Yamashita planned to avoid defending Manila. The city was indefensible and its destruction would be pointless. Instead, he would withdraw to the mountains and conduct a prolonged defense that would tie down American forces indefinitely. On January 9, 1945, after days of naval and air bombardment, the 6th Army stormed ashore at Leyte Gulf. The I Corps Major General Innis Swift landed on the left, the XIV Corps Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold on the right. Unlike Leyte, the landings were virtually unopposed. Yamashita had decided not to defend the beaches, instead withdrawing to prepared positions in the mountains. By nightfall, 68,000 troops were ashore with minimal casualties. It seemed too easy, and it was. Yamashita was executing his strategy. Let the Americans land, stretch their supply lines, then fight from positions where American firepower advantages were minimized. Over the following weeks, American forces would learn that taking Manila would be far harder than landing on Luzon. The advance toward Manila proceeded on multiple axes. The I Corps moved northeast toward the mountain strongholds. The XIV Corps drove south toward the capital. On January 31, the 11th Airborne Division conducted an amphibious and airborne assault at Nasugbu, south of Manila, to trap Japanese forces in the capital. On February 3, the 1st Cavalry Division's flying columns raced into northern Manila. MacArthur had hoped to liberate Manila intact, but General Yamashita's subordinate, Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding 16,000 naval troops in Manila, refused to withdraw. Iwabuchi fortified the city and prepared to fight to the death, directly contradicting Yamashita's orders. What followed was one of the Pacific War's most destructive urban battles. The Americans approached from 3 directions: the 1st Cavalry from the north, the 37th Infantry Division from the northeast, and the 11th Airborne from the south. Japanese forces occupied massive concrete buildings, particularly in the Intramuros district, the old walled city, transforming them into fortresses. Artillery and airstrikes that would normally support assaults were limited to avoid civilian casualties, but as the battle intensified, such restraint became impossible. The fighting was savage and close range. Tanks fired point-blank into buildings. Infantry cleared rooms with grenades and flamethrowers. Japanese troops fought from the sewers, emerging at night to attack American positions. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Worst of all, Japanese forces committed atrocities against Filipino civilians, massacres, rapes, and indiscriminate killings that would later be prosecuted as war crimes. The battle for the Philippine General Hospital exemplified the horror. Japanese forces had fortified the building and held Filipino patients and staff as human shields. American forces had to fight room by room, floor by floor, to liberate the hospital while Japanese soldiers killed patients and nurses. Similar scenes played out across the city. The Intramuros, Manila's oldest district, surrounded by massive Spanish-era walls, became a final redoubt. American forces pounded the walls with artillery, creating breaches through which infantry and tanks could attack. Japanese defenders fought with fanatical determination. By March 3, when the last resistance was eliminated, the Intramuros was rubble. The Battle of Manila cost approximately 1,000 American killed and 5,600 wounded. Of the 16,000 Japanese defenders, all but a few hundred were killed. But the civilian cost was catastrophic. An estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians died, victims of artillery, starvation, disease, and Japanese atrocities. Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, was the second most destroyed Allied city of World War II, surpassed only by Warsaw. MacArthur entered Manila on March 6, 3 years to the day after he had escaped from Corregidor. He declared the city liberated, though pockets of resistance remained for weeks. Standing in the ruins of his old headquarters, he delivered an emotional speech declaring the restoration of Philippine independence. But the campaign was far from over. MacArthur was determined to recapture Corregidor and Bataan, the sites of his 1942 defeat, both for strategic reasons and personal vindication. Corregidor, the fortified island commanding Manila Bay's entrance, had to be taken to allow ships to reach Manila's port. The island was defended by approximately 5,000 Japanese troops dug into the same tunnels and fortifications that Americans had used in 1942. On February 16, 1945, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment conducted a daring airborne assault, dropping onto Corregidor's topside while the 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry Regiment landed by sea. The paratroopers faced heavy casualties from the difficult drop zone. Many men were injured landing on broken concrete and debris, but secured key positions. Japanese forces retreated into Malinta Tunnel and other underground positions. What followed was a brutal battle in confined spaces. Americans sealed tunnel entrances with explosives and poured in gasoline, then ignited it. On February 21, a massive explosion, possibly an accidental detonation of Japanese ammunition stores, possibly deliberate suicide, destroyed much of Malinta Tunnel, killing hundreds of Japanese soldiers. By February 26, Corregidor was secure, though small groups of Japanese holdouts continued fighting for months. The recapture of Bataan was less dramatic but symbolically important. American forces swept through the peninsula in February, encountering minimal resistance. MacArthur visited the sites of the 1942 battles, a moment of personal closure. While Manila dominated headlines, the most prolonged and difficult fighting occurred in the mountains of northern and eastern Luzon. General Yamashita, with the Shabu Group numbering over 150,000 men, had withdrawn into the rugged terrain of the Cordillera Central. Here, in mountains rising to 9,000 feet, covered with jungle and dissected by deep valleys, the Japanese established defensive positions that would resist American advances for the remainder of the war. The I Corps fought a grinding campaign through these mountains. The 25th, 32nd, 33rd, and 37th Infantry Divisions advanced yard by yard against an enemy that used terrain masterfully. Japanese forces occupied caves and bunkers, defended narrow valleys, and launched counterattacks at night. American artillery and air power had limited effectiveness in the broken terrain. Infantry had to dig out each position individually. The fighting resembled the Western Front of World War I more than typical Pacific combat. Trenches, barbed wire, and fortified strongpoints characterized the battlefield. Casualties from both sides mounted steadily. By war's end, the I Corps had suffered over 9,000 casualties in the mountain fighting, while Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 dead. Similarly, in the mountains east of Manila, the XIV Corps fought the Shimbu Group in terrain equally challenging. The Battle of Mount Malpinio, the Battle of Ipoh Dam, and dozens of smaller engagements consumed infantry divisions throughout spring and summer 1945. Japanese forces fought with determination, knowing they could not win but determined to exact maximum cost. While Luzon consumed the majority of American forces, MacArthur ordered the liberation of the southern Philippines, partly for strategic reasons, partly to fulfill his promise to liberate all Filipinos. The 8th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, conducted a series of amphibious operations throughout the central and southern Philippines from February through July 1945. These operations followed a pattern: amphibious landing against light to moderate resistance, followed by prolonged inland fighting against Japanese forces withdrawing to mountain strongholds. The landings at Palawan, Mindanao, Panay, Negros, Cebu, and dozens of smaller islands succeeded rapidly, but mopping up Japanese defenders took months. Critics, both at the time and since, have questioned the necessity of these operations. With Japan itself under siege, with B-29s bombing Japanese cities, with the atomic bomb under development, did liberating every Philippine island serve strategic necessity or MacArthur's ego? The operations certainly cost lives, American, Filipino, and Japanese, for islands of limited strategic value. MacArthur defended the operations as necessary to liberate all Filipinos and to eliminate Japanese bases that could threaten American lines of communication. His critics suggested that many islands could have been bypassed, their garrisons left to wither on the vine like Rabaul. The debate continues among historians. The Philippine Campaign exacted a terrible human toll. American casualties totaled approximately 47,000, 10,380 killed, 36,550 wounded, and several hundred missing. Filipino casualties, both military and civilian, were far higher. Estimates range from 150,000 to over 500,000 dead, many from Japanese atrocities, starvation, and disease. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Of approximately 432,000 Japanese military personnel in the Philippines, an estimated 336,000 died, a loss rate exceeding 75%. Thousands more survived in isolated pockets, emerging from jungles only after Japan's surrender, some years later. The civilian suffering was immense. Japanese forces committed systematic atrocities against Filipino civilians, particularly in Manila but also throughout the islands. The rape of Manila, the Batangas massacres, and countless smaller incidents left scars that lasted generations. Filipino guerrilla forces, operating throughout the occupation, also contributed to the violence, settling scores with collaborators and engaging in reprisals. On July 4, 1945, MacArthur declared the Philippines liberated, though fighting continued until Japan's surrender in August. The declaration was political, recognizing Filipino independence, originally scheduled for July 4, 1946, and declaring the campaign successful, but militarily inaccurate. Thousands of Japanese troops remained in mountain strongholds, and combat operations continued. The ceremony took place in Manila, with Philippine President Sergio Osmeña presiding. MacArthur delivered a speech praising Filipino-American cooperation and Filipino loyalty during the dark years of occupation. He promised American support for reconstruction and full independence. The moment represented the culmination of his promise to return. But the Philippines MacArthur liberated was vastly different from the country he had left in 1942. Manila lay in ruins, its civilian population decimated. The countryside was devastated. The economy was shattered. Political divisions, sharpened by occupation and collaboration controversies, would complicate post-war governance. The liberation was real, but the cost had been immense. The Philippine Campaign remains controversial among military historians. Supporters argue it was strategically necessary, shortened the war by cutting Japan's supply lines, and fulfilled America's moral obligation to the Filipinos. The campaign tied down over 400,000 Japanese troops who could not be deployed to defend the home islands. It provided bases for the planned invasion of Japan. It demonstrated American commitment to its allies. Critics contend the campaign was unnecessary, that Formosa would have served strategic purposes equally well at lower cost, and that many operations, particularly in the southern Philippines, served MacArthur's ego rather than military necessity. They point to the high civilian casualties and extensive destruction, questioning whether liberation was worth such costs when Japan's defeat was already inevitable. MacArthur himself never doubted the campaign's necessity. To his death, he defended every decision as strategically and morally justified. His defenders note that he fought with concern for Filipino civilian casualties unusual for the time, that he employed Filipino forces extensively, and that he maintained political relationships that eased the transition to independence. On March 2, 1945, Douglas MacArthur stood before a microphone in Manila and declared, "My country kept the faith. Your capital city is yours once more." It was vintage MacArthur, dramatic, self-referential, emotionally powerful. But it was also true. He had promised to return, and he had returned. The Philippines were being liberated. The price was staggering. Tens of thousands of Americans killed or wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos dead. Over 300,000 Japanese soldiers killed. Manila destroyed. Countless villages razed. An economy shattered. But the Japanese were being driven from the Philippines, American honor was being restored, and the road to Tokyo was being paved. The Philippine Campaign was MacArthur's masterpiece and his most controversial operation. It vindicated his 1942 promise and demonstrated his operational skill. It also revealed his vanity, his political calculations, and his willingness to fight battles that some believed were unnecessary. It was a campaign driven by strategy and ego, by military necessity and personal redemption. For the Filipinos, liberation meant freedom from brutal occupation, but also devastation and loss. The Americans who fought there remembered the Philippines as a tough, costly campaign overshadowed by Iwo Jima and Okinawa, but equally demanding. The Japanese who survived remembered it as a pointless sacrifice, dying for islands that could not be held to delay an outcome that could not be avoided. 70 years later, the Philippine Campaign stands as a testament to MacArthur's force of personality, to Filipino-American cooperation, and to the terrible costs of modern war. MacArthur kept his promise. He returned, but the Philippines he liberated bore little resemblance to the islands he had left in 1942. Liberation had come at a price that would take generations to overcome. "I shall return," he had promised. He did, but as with all promises made in war, the keeping of it cost more than anyone had imagined when the words were first spoken.